and as he was passing out, the doctor saw the container doors opening. Sometime later, Dr. Keith woke up in a room with a woman in a white coat sitting next to him. Turns out these people are from the Scp Foundation. The woman in the white coat asks the doctor if anyone else on board the Pride of the Seas is uninfected besides him. He replies that everyone was infected and turned into these monsters. Then the woman presses a button, and two soldiers lock the doctor in a cell in the underwater base. Only then does Dr. Keith realize he's been captured. In the next cell sat a woman in an orange jumpsuit. She explains to the doctor what's going on here and why they're here. It turns out they're expendable for their experiments. At the other end of the hall, Dr. Keith could see several more cells. In them sat the infected. One was completely covered with toothy juras and was thrashing about his cell. The other, even more neglected, lay motionless on the floor and seemed to be eating itself. The woman also says that SCP agents found this anomaly here at the bottom and named it SCP-3760. Turns out Melissa was a test subject, too. They treated her with an amnestic and then wounded her leg to see what would happen. But somehow she managed to escape. She made it to the escape pods and made it to the surface. Becoming a guinea pig was not part of Dr. Keith's plans, so he comes up with an escape plan. The doctor finds a pair of tweezers in his inside pocket. It was so narrow, they didn't notice it when they searched him. This was his chance. He shows the tweezers to his cellmate. She takes the tweezers from the doctor and opens the lock on her camera in a couple minutes. It turns out that in a past life, she was a burglary specialist. Then she frees Dr. Keith, and they start looking for a way out together. With the next turn, the SCP Foundation soldiers saw them and rushed to catch up. The way to the escape pods was cut off, so they ran to the other wing to the lower floor. The soldiers kept up. Finally, they reached the airlock compartment, from which a long corridor stretched straight along the seabed. In front of the entrance, there were signs saying that this was a danger zone and that only employees with level 2 clearance were allowed to enter. At that moment, soldiers burst in and detain the woman in overalls. She resists as best she can, but is quickly knocked to the floor, and then she rips off one of the soldiers' badge with an electronic key and throws it to the doctor. She asks him to find this thing and avenge them all. The doctor doesn't wait for the soldiers to get to him. He quickly opens the airlock and sprints down the lighted corridor. Apparently, it stretches out to some kind of underwater cliffs. Dr. Keith almost reaches the second airlock when he hears screams behind him. The soldiers stop and begin to dissuade him from doing this. Moreover, they ran back in fear. There was no turning back, and the doctor continues to move on. In the second airlock, there were spacesuits for underwater research, and he decides that it would be a good idea to wear one. When the airlock doors open, he sees a natural cave that went down and was flooded with water. Dr. Keith dives in and moves forward. After a few yards, he sees a light and emerges from the water into a large hall. There was a sort of air pocket. There was equipment scattered around. Apparently, research was being done here. Suddenly, at that very moment, he hears a voice right in his head. The voice said it was waiting for him. The doctor starts to look around frightened, and suddenly the walls of the cave come alive. Thousands of eyes were looking straight at him, and their toothy mouths were grinning. It was all around. Dr. Keith found himself right inside this anomaly. The voice in the doctor's head was giving orders, and it was as if he couldn't disobey it. Suddenly, in one of the caves leading to the hall, the doctor notices movement. From there comes a huge creature that looks like a human, but is completely covered with toothy juras. Just then another one appeared from another cave and cut off his way out. The voice in his head was still ordering the doctor to give him the body. Terrified, he retreats backwards. He had nowhere to run. Suddenly he sees a bathyscaphe at the far end of the hall and rushes towards it. This was his chance for salvation. When the doctor is almost to the bathyscaphe, one of these creatures comes crashing down right in front of him from somewhere above. He doesn't have time to react. The toothy mouth bites the doctor's shoulder with a crunch. The doctor screams in terror and pushes the monster away. Ignoring the pain, he hops into the bathyscaphe and swims away. The voice in his head kept telling him to come back, but unfortunately the thing was malfunctioning. After a while, parts of the bathyscaphe began to fall off. By some miracle, Dr. Keith makes it out of the cave. At that moment, the engines shut down and the bathyscaphe begins to sink. Next to him, the doctor sees a familiar orange bundle, a life raft. Grabbing it, Dr. Keith climbs out. Suddenly, he notices a signal that his spacesuit seal has been breached. He had huge holes left on his shoulder from his teeth. This spacesuit began to fill with water and drag the doctor to the bottom. He quickly takes off his spacesuit and floats to the top. With his last strength, Dr. Keith strove there for salvation, and he succeeds. Having caught his breath, he realizes that he is alone in the center of the ocean. Pulling the rope, the doctor unfolds the raft. He climbs on it and passes out from exhaustion. When he wakes up, the doctor starts recording a video message. 2 days have passed since then, but no one has found him. There was no cell reception, so he waited impatiently for the rescuers. After all, he was running out of food, and the doctor needed to feed himself and all those nasty mouths. He had gotten infected after all. At this time, in the Scp Foundation's underwater base, a familiar woman informs the O5 Council that the Di-002 experiment was a success. This was the woman who helped Dr. Keith escape. It turns out it was all a setup. They deliberately left the doctor the opportunity to escape from the containment chamber, staging a chase and directing him to the cave where SCP-3760 was kept. Because Dr. Keith was special, he began hearing the voice of SCP-3760 before he was injured. It seems the anomalous object chose the doctor. The woman also tells us where Dr. Keith is at the moment. A merchant ship, the Atlantic, was heading in his direction. SCP Foundation agents were planning to run the protocol for the Di-003 experiment. Now Dr. Keith will infect people just like Melissa.